That night, Caleb Thompson didn't hear the sirens. He didn't hear the shouts, the crash of his daughter's body hitting the pavement. All he heard was the sound of his own heart breaking as he stood over the lifeless form of his 16 daughter Ava, bruised and battered after two racist cops left her for dead. No reason, no justification, just a hate that ran deep enough to silence the screams of a child. What the cops didn't know was that Caleb wasn't some helpless father. He was a man with a past that could undo everything they thought. They were untouchable from man. When Caleb walked into that hospital room, something inside him came alive, something darker, fiercer. And now, one by one, those who dared lay their hands on his daughter would disappear. Caleb Thompson had always been a man who prided himself on keeping a low profile. In his early 40s now, he was a man of routine, a simple life with a simple goal: provide for his family and stay out of trouble. His world was small, but it was his, and it was enough. His hands, calloused from years of hard work, moved through the motions of his day with the precision of someone who'd seen enough of life's chaos to know how to avoid it. A mechanic by trade, Caleb spent his days bent over engines, fixing what was broken, a few customers, some quiet exchanges, and a few greasy wrenches. That was all he needed. But Caleb wasn't just known for his work ethic. He was known for being a kind man, the kind of man who went out of his way to help people, to lend a hand when they were in need. His reputation around town was solid, reliable, trustworthy, someone you could count on when things got tough. His neighbors called on him for repairs, his friends turned to him for advice, and his family saw him as the steady anchor in their lives. He didn't speak much about the past, the life he'd left behind, but there were whispers, faint echoes of a younger man who'd done things that weren't as easy to forget. Still, Caleb had buried that life long ago, locked it in a box deep inside himself. His focus now was on the present, the quiet moments that mattered, the joy of a life that no longer required running, hiding, or fighting. And nothing brought him more joy than his daughter Ava. She was 16, the bright light of his life, with an infectious laugh and a smile that made the world feel like a better place. She wasn't just his daughter, she was his pride, his reason for living. If Caleb could have given her everything in the world, he would have. She was his anchor now, the one thing in this world that kept him from drifting back to the shadows of his past. She reminded him every day that there was something worth fighting for, something pure, something innocent. Ava was a good kid on a roll, no trouble with anyone, friendly but never needing the spotlight. She had big dreams. Caleb knew she'd go far. She wanted to be a doctor, to help people the way Caleb helped fix broken machines. She'd talk about it all the time, and Caleb, though he didn't always know how to articulate it, always made sure she knew he believed in her. He never said it outright, but she could see it in his eyes every time they sat together at the dinner table, or when he helped her with her homework at night. That night, like many before it, Caleb sat with Ava at the kitchen table. The soft yellow light from the overhead lamp cast a calm, warm glow over their simple dinner, just chicken and rice, nothing fancy, but that was the beauty of it. Ava, leaning forward with her school books scattered across the table, was trying to make sense of an English assignment. Caleb, seated across from her, juggled the task of helping her while also reading through a customer's repair request on his phone. "Dad, can you help me with this?" Ava asked, her voice a mixture of frustration and determination as she stared at the complex passage before her. Caleb glanced over at her, his focus shifting for a moment. He gave her a reassuring smile. "Let me see what you've got." He read the assignment for a moment, then pointed to a part of the paragraph. "You're overthinking it, honey. The key here is that the author's showing the conflict between hope and despair. See how they describe the setting. The bleakness of the world around the character mirrors what's happening inside them." Ava nodded, her frustration easing as her father explained it in simple terms. "That makes more sense," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Good," Caleb replied, settling back into his chair. "And remember, it's not just the words they use, it's the feeling behind them. Writers don't just write, they paint pictures with words." She grinned, picking up her pen to scribble a few notes. Caleb watched her, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. He couldn't have been more proud of the young woman Ava was becoming. His thoughts lingered for a moment on the future, their future. They had plans for the weekend, a trip to the local park to grab some fresh air. Caleb was looking forward to it, even if it was just for a few hours. Life wasn't about luxury. It was about moments like these, the simple, quiet moments that mattered most. He glanced at the clock on the wall. 5:45 p.m. The sun had set a little earlier than usual that day, and the night's chill was starting to settle in. He pulled out his phone to send a quick text to Ava's mother, Tina. It was a routine they had. Checking in, making sure everything was good. Dinner's almost ready. How's everything going? He didn't expect an immediate reply. Tina had her hands full with work and wasn't always quick to text back. Ava finished jotting down a few more notes and let out a sigh of relief. I think I'm done with this one. Thanks, Dad. Caleb smiled, but before he could respond, his phone buzzed again. It was a text from Ava's mum. Everything's good. Just finishing up here. Be home soon. Good, Caleb muttered to himself, sending a thumbs-up emoji back. Ava looked up from her book, her eyes tired but content. You're the best, you know that, she said, reaching over and giving him a brief hug. I know, kiddo, Caleb said softly, his voice gruff with affection. The evening passed with light conversation, some quiet moments shared over food. Caleb was already looking forward to the weekend, a small break from work to enjoy some time with Ava. The normal rhythm of their lives, the calm before the storm, was a feeling Caleb never took for granted. It was everything, but as the evening drew on, Caleb's phone buzzed again. The text was from an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before unlocking the screen. Caleb, it's Tina. Something's happened. Ava's been in an accident. You need to get to the hospital. Now. Caleb's heart stopped. The room suddenly felt too small, too cold. His stomach dropped like a rock into an abyss. He didn't know what had happened, but the urgent tone of the message was enough to tell him it was bad. He dropped his phone on the table, his hand shaking as he stood up. Ava hadn't left the house, hadn't even been outside. His thoughts spun in a dozen different directions, but one thing remained clear. Whatever it wasn't good. His legs carried him out the door faster than he could think, his mind racing, heart pounding, every instinct telling him to get to his daughter. Caleb didn't know it yet, but the world as he knew it was about to shatter in a way that would leave him broken in ways he could never have imagined. The air was thick with tension as Caleb's truck sped through the dark streets, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles were white. His heart pounded in his chest, an erratic rhythm that matched his growing fear. He had no idea what had happened, but Tina's words echoed in his mind. Ava's been in an accident. The hospital was 20 minutes away, but to Caleb, each second felt like an eternity. Every light that turned green seemed to mock him, moving him further from the truth, further from his daughter. His mind raced. Had she fallen off her bike, been hit by a car? Something far less than the worst, surely. There had to be an explanation for why Tina's voice had been so shaky. She wasn't one to panic easily, but then, why the urgency? What was really happening? His truck rumbled down the dimly lit streets of the city, and Caleb's eyes darted from one corner to the next, scanning for anything that could bring answers. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't even look at it. He couldn't. His stomach was tied in knots. The city seemed empty, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. When he finally pulled into the hospital parking lot, his stomach lurched. He barely parked, his truck still running as he leaped out of the driver's seat. He wasn't even sure which door to go through. The emergency room was up ahead, lights flashing in stark contrast to the growing darkness around him. Caleb pushed through the doors with the force of a man who was running on instinct, desperate to know what had happened, what was happening to his daughter. He spotted Tina immediately. She was standing by the nurse's desk, her face pale, her hands clasped together tightly in front of her. The sight of her only deepened the pit in his stomach. She looked as if she had already aged a decade in the span of minutes. Her eyes met his, and for a split second, neither of them said anything. There was nothing to say. The expression on her face said it all. Where is she? Caleb asked, his voice trembling slightly, despite his best effort to stay composed. Tina shook her head, her lips quivering as she finally spoke. Caleb, it's bad. She's in a coma. They beat her. Caleb, badly. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. His legs buckled, and he had to catch himself on the edge of the desk. Coma beat. His mind couldn't fully grasp what he was hearing. His Ava, the girl who'd been so full of life, so full of promise. Tina's eyes welled with tears, and she wiped at them quickly. 2 cops, Caleb. They pulled her out of the car. They just started hitting her. For no reason. She didn't do anything, just trying to get home. Caleb's blood ran cold. 2 cops. What the hell were they thinking? Why her? Why his daughter? I need to see her, Caleb whispered, his voice barely audible as the flood of panic mixed with confusion and rage. What happened? Why Ava? The nurse, having overheard the conversation, motioned toward the hallway leading to the ICU. Caleb didn't need another word. He followed her, Tina trailing behind him, her footsteps heavy in the silence. Each step felt like it was leading him deeper into a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Ava, his little girl, beaten. When they reached the room, the nurse paused, her face full of sympathy. "She's in critical condition, Mr. Thompson. We're doing everything we can. You can only stay for a few minutes." Caleb nodded, his breath shallow as he stepped inside. The first thing that hit him was the cold air, the sterile, clinical smell of the hospital. But nothing felt cold when he saw his daughter, unconscious on the bed. The sight of her, so still, so fragile, was like a slap in the face. She was hooked up to machines monitors, beeping steadily, oxygen flowing through a tube into her nose. Her face was swollen, one eye closed from bruising, a gash above her temple that still oozed faintly. Her jaw was wired shut. Caleb's heart shattered at the sight of her. She didn't look like as Ava. She was a broken version of the girl he knew, lying there as if the life had been drained out of her. Tina moved toward the bed, her hand reaching out to hold Ava's limp one, but Caleb couldn't move. He stood frozen at the doorway, unable to tear his eyes away from the devastation. In front of him, his world, his entire world, was lying there in that hospital bed, and it felt like everything he had ever known was slipping through his fingers. They said she was resisting," Tina whispered, her voice cracking. She looked up at Caleb, her eyes hollow. "But we both know that's a lie. She wouldn't resist. They did this." Caleb's fists clenched, and for a moment, everything around him faded. The room, the hospital, the pain in Tina's voice, everything disappeared. Except for one thing, rage. He didn't know who to be angry with first, those officers, the system, or himself for not being there when she needed him most. Ava had always been so safe, so innocent. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not to her, not to them. His jaw tightened, and a cold fury settled deep in his chest. Someone would pay. He couldn't allow this to go unanswered. She didn't resist, Caleb said, his voice steady but raw. She didn't deserve this. He reached for Ava's hand, his touch gentle, as if afraid to wake her from a sleep that wasn't peaceful at all. He stared at her, trying to force the image of the girl he knew, the girl full of life, into his mind. But the image of her battered, broken body refused to leave. Caleb leaned in close, pressing his lips to her forehead, his tears falling onto her skin. "I swear to you, Ava," he whispered through the lump in his throat, "I'll make them pay for this. No one touches you and gets away with it. Not now, not ever." It was the moment Caleb knew everything had changed. He was no longer the man who kept his head down, the man who stayed out of trouble. Something inside him had broken, something that had been dormant for years, and now it was awake. That as he pulled back from Ava's bedside, he stood tall, wiped his eyes, and stared at his daughter with a resolve he had never known before. The old Caleb, the quiet mechanic, the loving father, was gone. He wasn't sure what he would do next, but one thing was clear: he wouldn't stop until the men who did this were held accountable. They had taken his daughter, shattered her innocence, and left her broken. But he was a father, and he would tear the world apart to make them pay. Caleb didn't know how long he had been sitting by Ava's bedside. The world around him was fading, quiet and distant. He barely noticed the passing of time. Everything was swallowed up by the image of his daughter, lying there unconscious, so fragile and broken. His mind tried to cling to a sense of normalcy, to the peaceful man he had become. But the harder he fought to hold on to that person, the more it slipped from his grasp. His hands clenched into fists by his side, the muscles in his arms burning with the weight of the rage that was rising inside him. It was a rage he had buried long ago. Caleb wasn't always the man he was now. Once he was a different person, a man of action, a man of darkness, the kind of man who was capable of doing whatever it took to survive. He had been a military operative, a soldier who had operated in the shadows, taking on covert missions that no one else was prepared for. He had been trained to eliminate threats, to move unseen, to take life when necessary, without hesitation. There were things he had done that haunted him still, missions where morality was an afterthought, where the end justified the means. But that man, that monster, had died a long time ago, buried beneath the weight of fatherhood, beneath the love he felt for Ava. The moment his daughter had been born, Caleb made a promise to himself. He would never go back to that life. He would never let the darkness consume him again. For years he had kept that promise. He had buried the demons of his past deep inside, locked away in a place he never wanted to revisit. But now, as he sat by Ava's bedside, the past began to rise, clawing its way to the surface, reminding him that some things could never be left behind. He looked at Ava, her face battered, her body broken, and the promise he made to himself felt meaningless. How could he stay a man of peace when this had happened to his daughter? How could he let this go? Caleb didn't realize it, but his breathing had grown shallow, his pulse racing. He stood abruptly from his chair, his eyes flicking to the hallway outside the room, checking for any sign of someone watching, but no one was there. He stepped closer to the window, the cold glass pressing against his forehead as he stared out at the city below. The lights from the streets below seemed so far away, but his thoughts were far closer to home, closer to the rage that was now a part of him that he could feel deep in his bones. The hospital was still, the only sound a quiet hum of machines around him. Caleb had never been good at waiting. He hated it. His entire life had been about action, about doing. He had lived in a world of orders and consequences, where the only thing that mattered was the mission, and now, his mission was clear. It was time for him to reawaken the man he had buried, the man who could make people disappear, the man who had done terrible things but had done them because they had been necessary. Caleb's fingers twitched, remembering the feel of weapons in his hands, the precision required to make the world around him bend to his will. He could hear the faint echo of his past life, the distant orders, the sharp commands. The thought of returning to that world, of turning back into the person he had once been, sent a cold shiver down his spine. But as he thought of Ava, his daughter, lying in that bed, he realized something. There was no going back. There couldn't be. They had taken her. They had hurt her in ways no father could ever forgive. And now, he was going to make them pay. Caleb turned sharply from the window, his eyes locked on Ava's fragile form once more. His pulse was pounding in his ears, but there was clarity now. There was no more confusion. He knew what he had to do. He had to find those responsible. He had to make them understand that they couldn't just get away with this. And he was going to make sure that they paid, not just with their jobs or their reputations, but with their lives. They had stolen something from him that could never be replaced. And now, it was time for him to return to the darkness, to unleash the fury he had kept locked away for so long. But Caleb knew he couldn't do this alone. Not anymore. He picked up his phone, his fingers shaking slightly as he scrolled through his contacts. He hesitated for only a second before dialing the number. It rang once, then twice, before a voice on the other end picked up. Caleb, the voice asked, gruff but familiar. It was Victor, an old contact from his military days. Caleb hadn't spoken to him in years, but he knew Victor was the kind of man who could get things done quietly, efficiently, without questions. Victor, Caleb said, his voice low, tight with the weight of what he was about to ask. I need your help. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Victor spoke, his voice tinged with curiosity. What's going on, Caleb? They've hurt my daughter. 2 cops. I need everything you've got on them. There was no hesitation from Victor, not even a pause. I'll get you what you need. You know that. Caleb exhaled, the breath, feeling like it had been trapped in his chest for years. I don't want them just gone, Victor. I want them exposed. I want the world to see who they really are. Victor was silent for a moment. I understand. Caleb hung up the phone and stood motionless for a moment. His mind was already running through the steps, tracking them, learning everything about them, finding their weaknesses. He would use everything at his disposal, every connection he had, to tear down the system that had allowed this to happen. As the minutes passed, Caleb felt the transformation take place inside him. He wasn't just a father anymore. He was a force of nature, a man who had once been trained to tear apart the world around him, and now, the world was going to see that side of him again. But even as Caleb prepared to begin his hunt, a part of him deep down, buried beneath the rage, felt a flicker of doubt. This wasn't the man he wanted to be, but there was no room for that man now. Not anymore. Ava's life, her future, had been ripped from her, and the man who had taken it, the men who had allowed it to happen, had no idea what they were about to face. They would learn the hard way that Caleb Thompson wasn't just a mechanic, a father, a quiet man. He was something else entirely. As the days passed, Caleb's thoughts began to twist inside him. He had already started making plans, gathering intel, reaching out to people from his old network. But the weight of it was suffocating. His mind fought against itself. Part of him still wanted to stay the man he had become, a peaceful father, a protector, someone who showed love and patience to those around him. But another part of him, the darker part, the part that had been buried beneath the years of normalcy, was rising again. Every time Caleb sat by Ava's bedside, watching the machines that kept her alive, he could feel that old man inside him, pulling at the edges of his sanity, and it terrified him. Who was he becoming? The monster he once was had been buried for a reason. The violence, the coldness, it was a side of him he had locked away. But now, with each passing hour, he could feel it creeping back into his mind, whispering to him, "You have to do this, Caleb, you have to make them pay." He wasn't sure how long he could hold on, how long before he completely gave in to the rage that threatened to consume him. But no matter how much he struggled against it, one truth remained clear. He was no longer just a father. Caleb was about to become something far worse. The city outside Caleb's small garage was alive with the hum of normalcy. People went about their days, some stopped for coffee, others ran errands. Some laughed with friends, but Caleb barely noticed. His life had narrowed to a single point: revenge. The moment he'd seen his daughter lying unconscious, broken beyond recognition, he had known nothing would be the same. He had already made his peace with that. The real question now was how far he would go to tear down the system that had done this to her. He had spent hours at the hospital, day and night, waiting for Ava to wake up. Her condition remained the same: critical, stable but unconscious. But each time he sat beside her bed, the rage inside him grew. It was time to act. Caleb didn't just want to make the officers pay. He didn't just want to see them suffer. No, what Caleb wanted was to destroy them, to make sure they never had the chance to hurt anyone again. But he knew he couldn't just kill them in some impulsive act of vengeance. That would be too easy. He needed something more: proof, evidence, the truth. And Caleb was meticulous. Always had been. So he began the hunt. His first step was simple: surveillance. Caleb's old military training kicked in immediately. Like a switch had been flipped. He began by tracking Officer Bradley and Officer Monroe, two men who had attacked his daughter. Their routines, their schedules, their movements, everything. He had the benefit of knowing how they thought, how they moved. He knew they'd be arrogant, careless. They assumed they were untouchable. And Caleb was about to show them how wrong they were. He set up his equipment, a combination of high-powered binoculars, a few carefully placed cameras, and a secure line of communication with his old contacts in the tech world. He wasn't about to make the mistake of being careless. Not now. Over the next few days, Caleb tracked every step they took. He followed Officer Bradley's patrol route, watching him visit the same diner on Thursdays, the same strip club on Fridays. He noted the way Officer Monroe went home every night to a quiet neighborhood, leaving his cruiser parked in the same spot, as if nothing could touch him. It wasn't hard to see the holes in their routines, the carelessness, the arrogance. They'd been doing the same thing for years, running the same plays. They thought they could do whatever they wanted, and no one would care. But Caleb was different. He wasn't just another victim in the system. He wasn't a number in their file. Caleb didn't just want to watch them, he wanted to know everything about them: their families, their finances, their habits, the little things that could reveal who they really were beneath the badge. He spent days hacking into their personal files, using old contacts to access databases and find out more than he should have known about the officers' backgrounds. The deeper he dug, the more he uncovered Bradley's gambling problem, his hidden debts, and the shady connections he kept. Monroe's history of excessive force complaints, his pattern of harassment against people of color. Each detail made Caleb more determined. These men weren't just corrupt, they were rotten. To the core, they had been abusing their power for years, and it was time to expose them for who they really were. But Caleb didn't want to rush it. He knew better than to act impulsively. The law enforcement system was corrupt, but it wasn't stupid. If he was going to make his move, he had to build a case, something irrefutable, something that would expose them, and make sure the public couldn't ignore the truth. Caleb set up his headquarters in the back room of his garage, turning it into a makeshift war room. Photos of the officers Bradley and Monroe lined the walls, pinned up with red strings connecting them to places, dates, times. Caleb used the information he had gathered to make a map of their lives, their actions, a map that would lead him straight to their downfall. He went to work, gathering every piece of evidence he could find: witness statements, photos of Bradley's altercations with civilians, Monroe's history of discrimination cases, buried under bureaucratic red tape. He even tapped into old police records, using his network to get his hands on internal reports that documented years of misconduct. The more he found, the more disgusted he became. These weren't just two bad apples, they were part of something much bigger, a system of corruption that allowed people like them to thrive, to abuse their power without fear of consequence. Every report Caleb uncovered added to his fury. He started to see the pattern: the way the department protected its own, the way it covered up the worst crimes, especially those involving people of color. Each night, after the day's work in his garage, Caleb would return to the hospital to sit by Ava's side. And with every new detail he uncovered, the rage within him grew. He was no longer just doing this for his daughter. He was doing this for everyone who had ever been hurt by people like Bradley and Monroe. The system had to be torn down. He wasn't just hunting to mend, he was hunting an entire system. The more Caleb dug, the more he realized how deep the corruption, when it wasn't just Bradley and Monroe. It wasn't just about them being racist or violent. There was something far more insidious at play. The department itself was built on corruption. These officers were just the tip of the iceberg. He tapped into a more dangerous source of information, his old military contacts who still had their fingers in places of power. People who could dig deeper into police unions, department heads, internal affairs. And what Caleb uncovered made him sick. He learned that the department had been systematically covering up abuse cases for years. Complaints of brutality, excessive force, and racial profiling weren't just ignored. Actively buried files went missing. Witnesses were coerced into silence. Complaints that went public were twisted and distorted. There were records of cases where officers had been caught on camera abusing their power, only to walk free after a quick internal investigation or an out-of-court settlement. Caleb's stomach twisted as he reviewed the documents. The internal memos detailing how the higher-ups had conspired to protect these officers, how they had worked together to cover up the pattern of abuse. The deeper he got, the more he saw how it wasn't just Bradley and Monroe, it was the whole fucking system. A system that allowed them to get away with murder because they were above the law. It wasn't just about making these two officers pay. It was about exposing the entire structure that allowed this kind of abuse to continue unchecked. As Caleb pieced the puzzle together, the tension inside him began to build. He knew this wasn't just going to be about vengeance anymore, it was something bigger. Something more dangerous. If he exposed these officers, if he brought the world into the corruption of this department, it could change everything. The problem was, Caleb didn't just want justice. He didn't just want to make Bradley and Monroe pay for what they'd done. He wanted to tear down the entire system, and that meant using every tool at his disposal, every contact, every piece of leverage, everything he'd learned from his days in the field. But the deeper Caleb went, the more isolated he became. He couldn't share this with anyone, he couldn't trust anyone. The people he once considered allies, the ones he'd fought alongside in battle, were gone. He was alone in this. His path had already been set, and there was no turning back. By the time Caleb had gathered enough evidence to act, his mind was already made up. He had a plan, one that would ensure Bradley and Monroe would never hurt anyone again, and one that would expose the department for what it truly was. He would take the information to the public. He would make sure every piece of evidence, every document, every image, was shared far and wide. But even as he set his plan into motion, one last question lingered in his mind. Was this really the man he had become? Caleb knew that if he went through with this, if he followed through on his mission, there would be no going back. He would be stepping into the darkness completely. There would be no redemption, no forgiveness. But for the first time in years, Caleb didn't care. The night was heavy with anticipation. As Caleb sat in the dimly lit room of his garage, his mind racing with thoughts of the confrontation ahead. He had waited for this moment for days, each minute feeling like an eternity. He had been preparing, gathering information, collecting evidence, but now it was time to face the man who had hurt his daughter, Officer Bradley. Bradley had always been a loose cannon, known for his violent outbursts, his temper flaring when he felt challenged. But Caleb knew there was something else beneath the surface, something darker. Racism, he had seen it in the way Bradley treated civilians, in the way he took pleasure in throwing his weight around. Bradley wasn't just a bad cop, he was a man who thrived on power, who believed the badge gave him permission to do whatever he wanted, without consequence. And Caleb was about to make him feel the weight of his actions. The plan was simple: get Bradley alone, get him to a place where he felt safe, where his guard was down, and then confront him with the truth he had spent so long hiding. Caleb knew Bradley would never admit to his crimes voluntarily, but that wasn't the point. This wasn't about justice in the traditional sense. This was about making him feel the consequences of his actions, about exposing the man behind the badge, and forcing him to look into the eyes of the monster he had become. Caleb had already made the necessary arrangements. He knew Bradley's schedule, knew the bars he frequented, the times he was off duty. Caleb had set up a meeting under the guise of wanting to resolve an issue, a trivial matter, something to get Bradley's attention and lure him into a false sense of security. He knew Bradley would take the bait. Men like him always did. Caleb stood outside the bar, his breath steady and controlled as he watched the entrance. The neon lights flickered above him, casting an eerie glow over the streets. It was the kind of place where officers like Bradley went to unwind after a long shift. Still noisy, and full of people who didn't ask questions. Caleb had been here before, back when he was a different man, but tonight he wasn't there to drink or talk. He was there for a much darker purpose. He checked his watch. Bradley would be arriving soon. Caleb had made sure to pick a time when the bar was quiet enough for a private conversation, but not so empty that Bradley would feel threatened. Caleb wasn't in the business of drawing attention, not yet. As Bradley pulled up in his cruiser, Caleb's pulse didn't skip a beat. He had prepared for this moment. He'd waited long enough. Caleb walked toward the door, his feet firm on the ground, each step leading him closer to what he knew had to be done. The man he was about to face had caused his daughter unimaginable pain, and Caleb would make sure he never forgot the price of that mistake. Bradley stepped out of his cruiser, his bulky frame framed by the dim glow of the streetlights. He didn't notice Caleb at first, his eyes scanning the parking lot, his expression indifferent. He walked toward the entrance, his boots heavy on the concrete. Caleb stepped into his path. "Bradley," Caleb called out, his voice calm but firm. Bradley stopped, narrowing his eyes. He didn't recognize Caleb at first, but the name had some familiarity. Caleb had kept a low profile for years, but now, with a few choice words, everything was about to change. "I'm Caleb Thompson," Caleb continued, standing his ground. "We need to talk." Bradley looked him up and down, his brow furrowing. "What about Ava?" Caleb said, his voice low, just enough to let the words land. Bradley's expression shifted. His eyes hardened, but only for a moment. "Ava, I don't know who the hell you are, but if you're talking about some kind of problem, you can take it up with the department." Caleb shook his head, the frustration mounting in his chest. "This isn't just about some problem, Bradley, it's about what you did. What you did to my daughter." Bradley stepped closer, a cocky grin crossing his face. "I don't have time for this, man. You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I know exactly what I'm talking about," Caleb said, his voice a little colder now. "I know all about your record, about the things you've done in the past, things that the department covered up, your little temper tantrums, your abuse of power, all of it." Bradley's grin faltered, but he quickly masked it with anger. "I don't have to explain myself to you." Caleb's eyes narrowed. "You're right, you don't have to explain anything, but you will listen." Caleb moved, his steps measured, his presence calm but unyielding. He wasn't here for a fight, not yet. He was here to expose Bradley for what he was, a coward hiding behind a badge. And Caleb wasn't about to let him escape that truth. "You've done this before, haven't you?" Caleb continued, stepping closer. "Pulled over someone because of the color of their skin, used your badge to intimidate, beat people into submission. I know it, Bradley. And now, you did the same thing to my daughter. You beat her for no reason. You didn't just hurt her, you nearly killed her." Bradley's face twisted, his hands clenching into fists. "Shut your mouth, man." But Caleb wasn't finished. "No, you listen to me. I know everything about you, about the things you've done in the past. I know about the times you've gotten off easy because of who you are, because of the system that protects you. You think you're untouchable," Bradley scoffed, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes now. Caleb had landed a hit. "You think I'm scared of you?" Bradley sneered. "No," Caleb replied, "but you should be scared of the truth. You should be scared of what's coming." Bradley's breath quickened, but he didn't back down. "You don't know what you're messing with, Thompson." "No," Caleb said, his voice a whisper now, his words cutting through the tension like a blade. "I'm the man who's going to make you pay for what you've done, and I'm not going to stop until you're exposed for the monster you are." For a moment there was silence between them. The weight of Caleb's words hung in the air, thick with a tension that neither could escape. Caleb had made his point, but there was one more thing he had to do, one final message to ensure that Bradley understood the gravity of what he was facing without warning. Caleb reached into his jacket and pulled out a small folded envelope. He tossed it onto the hood of Bradley's cruiser. The officer flinched, his eyes darting to the envelope, then back to Caleb. The shift in Bradley's demeanor was subtle, but Caleb could see it. "You open that," Caleb said, his voice low, "and you'll know exactly how far I'm willing to go. You're not getting out of this, Bradley, not this time. The truth is coming for you, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." Bradley hesitated, his eyes flicking between Caleb and the envelope, but Caleb could see the doubt creeping. Inye could see the fear beneath the anger. "You walk away from this, and your life goes on," Caleb continued, his tone like steel. "But you don't ever forget that I know exactly what you've done. And the next time I come for you, there will be nowhere to run." Bradley's breath came in short, quick gasps, but he didn't respond. He just stared at Caleb, his expression unreadable. Caleb stepped back, his body taut with the anticipation of what was to come. "Consider this the beginning," Caleb said, turning away and walking into the shadows of the night. "You're not the first man I've hunted, and you won't be the last." Caleb didn't look back as he disappeared into the night. He didn't need to. He knew the message had landed, and he knew Bradley would be haunted by the weight of it. But Caleb wasn't finished. This wasn't just about Bradley. This wasn't just about one man. It was about sending a message to the entire corrupt system that had protected men like him. And Caleb's vengeance would unfold in ways that Bradley couldn't possibly predict. As Caleb walked away, the night felt heavier than before. He knew the storm was just beginning, and he would make sure that every piece of it would break the system that had allowed men like Officer Bradley to walk free. The night air was thick with tension as Caleb stood in the shadows, watching. His heart didn't pound like it had the night before when he faced Officer Bradley. That had been a test, a warning. Tonight he was dealing with Monroe, and Caleb knew he would need a different approach. Monroe was a different breed altogether. Unlike Bradley, whose arrogance came from sheer disregard for the law, Monroe had always believed he was untouchable because of his position. He wasn't reckless, he was calculated, confident in his place within the police force. He walked around like the world owed him something, and Caleb could feel the weight of his arrogance every time he thought about the man. Monroe wasn't just a product of a broken system. He was someone who relished the power that system gave him. But Caleb knew something else. Monroe wasn't just arrogant, he was insecure. He had built his life on the idea that no one would challenge him, that no one would dare to bring him down. The problem with people like Monroe was that their pride was their greatest weakness, and Caleb was going to use it against him. Tonight, Caleb wasn't going to just confront Monroe. He wasn't going to be like he had been with Bradley and direct. This was going to be different. He had to make Monroe feel like he was the one in control, that he was about to make a deal he couldn't refuse. The setup had to be perfect, and Caleb had already planned every detail. Caleb set the stage carefully, picking a location that would ensure the confrontation would be public enough to make Monroe feel secure, but not so crowded that it would attract attention. He needed to push Monroe's ego to its limits, to get him to think he was dealing with a powerful underground syndicate. A network of people that Caleb had fabricated with a few key calls and some clever manipulation of his past connections. The meeting place was a small cafe on the edge of Towner Place Monroe frequented after his shifts, where he enjoyed his coffee and pretended that no one knew who he really was. Caleb had arranged for one of his old contacts to send a message to Monroe's phone, making him believe that there was a potential deal to be made, a business proposition that Monroe couldn't resist. Caleb had crafted the message perfectly. A mix of veiled threats and promises of power, the kind of language that would play into Monroe's need to feel dominant, to be in control. At exactly 10:15 p.m., Caleb watched as Monroe's cruiser pulled into the lot. The man was already dressed casually, confident in his ability to blend in. Caleb couldn't help but smirk as he observed Monroe's casual swagger, how he walked as though the world revolved around him. Monroe entered the cafe, his eyes scanning the room, clearly looking for anyone who seemed out of place. But Caleb had already secured a corner table, far enough in the back that he wouldn't be immediately noticed, but close enough to make his presence felt. He watched as Monroe's gaze swept the room, stopping for a moment at Caleb's location, but failing to recognize him. Caleb had changed his appearance just enough, shaving the scruff on his face and donning a black jacket, a look Monroe wouldn't associate with the man who had confronted Bradley. When Monroe sat down at the table, Caleb didn't waste time. He slid a glass of water across the table, his face neutral but purposeful. He had planned for this meeting to be a slow burn, to draw Monroe in with promises of power and potential. But Caleb's patience was wearing thin. The moment Monroe settled into the chair, Caleb began. "I've heard a lot about you, Monroe," Caleb said, his voice calm and controlled, eyes locked on Monroe's. Monroe sat back in his chair, his lips curling into a confident grin. "And what exactly have you heard?" "I don't deal with amateurs." Caleb could feel Monroe's arrogance radiating off him, but he knew how to handle it. He wasn't here to be intimidated. He was here to break Monroe's sense of superiority. "I hear you've been taking advantage of your position," Caleb continued. "You've got a nice little racket going, don't you? The right people in the right places. Always a few steps ahead of everyone else. But the thing about people like you, Monroe, they get too comfortable." Monroe's smirk faded just slightly, but Caleb knew that he had Monroe's attention now. The cop leaned forward, his tone shifting slightly. "What are you getting at?" Caleb kept his expression neutral, but the truth of what he said was already sinking in. Monroe's calm exterior was starting to crack. The seed of doubt had been planted. Now Caleb needed to water it. I'm getting at the fact that you've crossed a line, Caleb said, his voice lower now, tinged with just the right amount of menace. You've done things in the dark, things you thought would never see the light. You've hurt people who didn't deserve it, and you think no one will ever know. Monroe's eyes narrowed slightly, but Caleb pressed on. You think you're untouchable, but you're wrong. I know everything about you, your past, your little schemes, the people you've abused along the way. The department's dirty little secret. At this, Monroe's expression faltered for just a moment. Caleb saw it, the brief flicker of fear, the flash of vulnerability beneath his arrogance. Caleb wasn't done yet. You thought you could keep it all hidden, that the people who would have made you pay would never find out. But I'm not just anyone, Monroe. I'm a man who knows how to expose the truth. The tension in the air was thick, heavy with unsaid words. Monroe sat there, his mouth pressed into a thin line, his fingers tapping nervously against the edge of his coffee cup. Caleb had him rattled. The game was no longer about power. It was about control. Monroe cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. I don't know what you think you're doing here, but I don't have time for games. Oh, this is no game, Monroe, Caleb replied smoothly. This is reality. I know about the bribes you've taken, the way you've used your badge to terrorize the people who can't defend themselves. I know about the money you've made, the dirty deals you've arranged, and I know that you thought you were safe because you wore that uniform. Monroe's face was flushing now, his earlier arrogance replaced by something more primal fear. Caleb had pushed him to the edge, and now it was time to shove him over. Do you really think you're the only one with skeletons in the closet? Caleb continued, his voice steady, never breaking. You're just a cog in the machine, Monroe. But that machine is about to come crashing down, and you're not going to be able to hide behind that badge anymore. Monroe's gaze hardened, but there was something different in his eyes, now a shift. Caleb could see it. The man who had once been so confident was now questioning everything, and Caleb was going to make sure he stayed that way. Tell you what, Caleb said, leaning in closer, the corner of his mouth curling into a slight, knowing grin. I'm going to expose you for what you really are. I'm going to make sure the world knows exactly who you are. And when that happens, you'll be lucky if you're just fired. You'll wish you were fired. Caleb stood up and walked toward the door, leaving Monroe in the cafe, shaken and disoriented. He had done exactly what he needed to shattered Monroe's illusion of invincibility. But Caleb wasn't done yet. As he left the cafe, Caleb pulled out his phone and sent the final part of his plan into motion. Over the next few hours, he sent out encrypted messages to various anonymous accounts, uploading all the evidence he had gathered, videos, photos, police records, everything. Monroe had no idea what was coming for him, but Caleb knew one thing. For sure this was just the beginning. Monroe's pride, his arrogance, would be his undoing. Caleb had planted the seeds of doubt, and now, the truth would spread like wildfire. The world would know exactly what Monroe had done. The department would be forced to face the corruption that had been festering for years, and Monroe would have to live with the weight of his actions, the shame of being exposed. Caleb had sent a message, not just to Monroe, but to every man and woman who thought they could hide behind a badge. This wasn't just about vengeance, this was about exposure. And Caleb wasn't finished yet. The aftermath of Caleb's actions was swift, violent in its own way. The viral spread of the video exposing Officer Monroe's confession was the final spark that ignited an inferno of outrage. It was impossible to ignore. The truth, raw and unfiltered, now belonged to the people. It didn't matter how the police department or the mayor tried to cover it up. It was already too late. Ava's case, the unjust brutality she had suffered, became a symbol, a rallying cry for racial justice, for police accountability. The video had exposed not only Monroe's actions, but the deep-seated corruption that had allowed men like him to thrive for years. Caleb's careful planning had ensured that the evidence he collected wasn't just seen, it was felt. Across the city, protests erupted. From the poorest neighborhoods to the richest enclaves, people took to the streets. Signs that read "Justice for Ava" and "End Police Corruption" flooded social media, and soon they flooded the city itself. Caleb wasn't watching the protests unfold. He didn't need to. He had already won. But the system, the same system that had protected men like Monroe, like Bradley, like Captain Daniels, was beginning to crumble, and Caleb was right in the middle of it. The chaos was swift. Social media posts exploded with fury, hashtags like #JusticeForAva trending worldwide. News outlets scrambled to cover the growing protests, some framing it as a civil rights movement reignited, others still questioning the narrative, trying desperately to hold on to the lie The video of Monroe, caught red-handed, confessing to his abuse of power, his participation in the systemic violence, circulated like wildfire. And then came the leaks. Caleb had made sure of it. Files, recordings, photographs, everything Monroe had hidden was now public. Caleb wasn't just exposing a single officer. He was exposing a whole system of corruption that had protected these officers for years. The protests were more than just about one man, they were about the truth that Caleb had revealed. Ava had become the face of something bigger. Her story, her suffering, had become the catalyst that had forced the city to reckon with its dirty little secret. By the time the video had gone viral, the entire city was divided. The mayor, the police department, and the corrupt officials who had kept this system in place were scrambling. They couldn't pretend it was just an isolated incident anymore. The floodgates had opened. Inside the mayor's office, it was chaos. Her staff was working overtime, trying to contain the fallout. The video had gone viral in a way that no one had expected. News vans lined the streets outside her office, cameras trained on her every move. Protesters shouted outside the city hall, demanding action. Inside, the mayor and her team were trying desperately to control the narrative, but it was slipping through their fingers. She had spent years turning a blind eye to the corruption inside the police force. It wasn't that she didn't know about it, she had turned a blind eye to it. But now, with the video and the protests escalating, the stakes were higher than ever. The city was no longer going to tolerate the police brutality that had gone unchecked for years. People were demanding accountability. Caleb's name hadn't been publicly linked to the leaks yet, but it wouldn't take long. His fingerprints were all over the evidence, they knew it. But the mayor's office wasn't focused on finding him, they were too busy trying to shut it all down. She gave her team the orders to focus on damage control. She ordered internal investigations, a public apology, and even claimed the department would undergo reform. But everyone saw through the rhetoric. The truth was already out. But Caleb was already moving on to the next phase. He had achieved everything he needed to with the officers. Bradley and Monroe were exposed, but there was still one last man to deal with. Captain Daniels, the head of the police department, the man who had allowed all of this to happen, the man who had protected officers like Bradley and Monroe, the man who ran the show. The problem with men like Daniels was that they were the ones who pulled the strings, who stood above the corruption and directed it all. He wasn't just part of the system, he was the system. And Caleb knew that exposing him wasn't going to be enough. It wouldn't be enough to just ruin his career, to tarnish his name. Daniels had to be destroyed. Caleb had already begun gathering intel on Daniels. He had sources in high places, some of the same contacts who had helped him expose the officers. But unlike with Monroe, Caleb wasn't going to leave things to chance. He had waited long enough, but now it was time to take action. This time, it was personal. Caleb had already seen what Daniels was capable of. This wasn't just about justice anymore, it was about taking down the one man who could hold the whole corrupt system together. Caleb wasn't about to let him get away with it. It was late, and the city was still buzzing with the aftermath of the protests. Caleb had tracked Daniels to his usual restaurant, a quiet place he frequented for his late dinners. Caleb had seen him there before, many times, over the years. The arrogant way he carried himself, the smile that never reached his eyes. Tonight was different. Caleb wasn't here to play games. He wasn't here to negotiate or warn. This wasn't like Bradley or Monroe. This time, Caleb knew exactly what had to be done. He sat at a table across from Daniels, watching him as the man sipped his wine. He didn't recognize Caleb. He wouldn't, not after all these years. Caleb had changed his appearance just enough for this final confrontation. Daniels had always thought he was untouchable, the system's untouchable king. But tonight, Caleb was going to make him realize that even kings fall. "I've seen you around," Daniels said, leaning back in his chair as Caleb took a seat opposite him. "What can I do for you?" Caleb didn't smile. He didn't need to. "You've done enough already, Captain. And now it's time for you to face the consequences." Daniels chuckled, taking another sip of his wine. "You must be mistaken. I don't know who you are, but if you think you can intimidate me, I'm not here to intimidate you," Caleb interrupted. "I'm here to end you." Daniel's smugness faltered just for a moment, but it was enough. Caleb could see the flash of realization in his eyes. Daniels had figured it out. Caleb wasn't playing anymore. "What do you want?" Daniels asked, his voice suddenly tight. Caleb didn't respond. He just pulled out his phone and showed Daniels a video, the very last video Caleb needed to complete his mission. The final piece of evidence. Daniels had thought he was safe, but now he was trapped. The video was a confession, an admission of his involvement in the corruption, the cover-ups, and the abuse. The people he had protected for so long would now see who he really was. The man who had orchestrated it all. The realization hit Daniels like a ton of bricks. His face paled as he stood up abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. "You can't do this," Daniels barked. But Caleb didn't move. He didn't flinch. "You're done, Daniels," Caleb said, his voice quiet, but firm. "The truth is out. The people will never let you go. Your empire is crumbling." Daniels looked desperate now, but it was too late. Caleb had already won. When the news broke the next day, it was final. The video, the files, the confessions, everything was out there. The mayor couldn't contain it. The police department was already in freefall, and Daniels had nowhere to hide. Protests intensified, growing larger as people demanded not only the resignation of Daniels, but also the dismantling of the entire department. Caleb had done it. He had taken down the most corrupt elements of the system, one piece at a time. As the city turned against the system that had allowed the abuse to flourish, Caleb knew he had destroyed something much larger than just a few officers. He had exposed the heart of the corruption itself, and as he sat in the quiet of his garage, looking out at the chaos he had set in motion, Caleb finally allowed himself a moment of reflection. His daughter was still in the hospital, still recovering. Now she would have a future. He had done what needed to be done. The air in the hospital room was still, quiet, almost reverent. Caleb sat beside Ava's bed, his hand resting gently on hers. The steady beeping of the monitor the only sound filling the space. His mind was still racing with the events of the past few days, events that had irrevocably changed his life, and the lives of so many others. The officers were gone. The system had been exposed. But there was no victory dance, no celebration. His daughter, the girl who had been broken and battered, who had been left to die in the street, was alive. Slowly she was coming back to him, but the cost of what he had done, the toll vengeance had taken on his soul, was not something Caleb could escape so easily. He watched as Ava's eyes fluttered open, the soft blue of her gaze catching his, a small flicker of recognition dancing in her expression. His heart tightened. It was a moment he had dreamed of for weeks. The moment when she would wake up, when she would be able to look at him and smile. But as much as he wanted to rejoice, as much as he wanted to let the weight of it all wash over him, he couldn't. He was still haunted by the choices he had made, the life he had taken, the darkness he had walked through, couldn't just be left behind. Ava's voice, weak and raspy, pulled him from his thoughts. "Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Caleb squeezed her hand, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I'm right here, baby. I'm right here." Ava blinked a few times, trying to clear the fog in her mind. Her eyes moved around the room, slowly taking in the sterile surroundings. Then they focused on him, and the smile she gave him was soft but full of love. "You did it, didn't you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Caleb's throat tightened. He nodded, though the words caught in his chest. He didn't know how to explain it all to her, not yet. Not when she was still recovering from the horror that had been done to her. "You're safe now," Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're alive. That's what matters." Ava tried to move her hand, to touch her face, but she winced in pain. The bruises were still there, the evidence of the violence that had been inflicted upon her. Caleb couldn't help but feel the guilt that gnawed at him, even now. But he pushed it down. There was nothing more he could do about it. What mattered was that she was alive. He had saved her. He had done what needed to be done to protect her, to ensure that the men who had done this would never hurt anyone again. Ava's eyes grew heavy again, exhaustion claiming her as the sedation from the coma lingered. But before she closed her eyes, she gave him one last look, one that said everything she didn't have the energy to say. She trusted him. She knew that, despite the way the world had tried to tear them apart, her father had fought for her, and she was alive because of him. Caleb sat there for hours after Ava drifted back to sleep, his mind turning over and over again. The chaos of the protests had finally calmed. The videos of the officers' confessions had flooded the media. The truth was out, and the city was in the process of rebuilding, reforming, but the victory he had fought for didn't feel like a win, not yet. The weight of what he had done was starting to settle on his shoulders, and Caleb realized something deep inside. There was no turning back. He had stepped into the darkness, taken everything he had learned in the shadows of his past, and used it to shatter the very system that had allowed his daughter to be brutalized. The officers were gone. The corrupt Captain Daniels was exposed. The department would never be the same. But Caleb knew the cost of his actions. He had become something else, someone else. The man who had been content with fixing cars, with raising his daughter in peace, had vanished. In his place was a man who had broken the law, who had shed his humanity to unleash hell on those who had hurt his family. He couldn't deny the satisfaction he had felt, the power of watching the system crumble beneath him. But there was no joy in it. There was no pride. The vengeance had been cold, calculated, but it had taken more from him than he had expected now. As he sat in the sterile hospital room, Caleb knew that the emotional toll was just beginning. He had taken down corrupt officers. He had torn apart the system that had allowed them to exist. But what had he sacrificed in the process? What was left of the man he had once been? His thoughts drifted back to his past, the life he had buried in the name of family, the man he had been before. Ava, before the love that had softened him. That man was gone, and no matter how much he told himself he had done it all for Ava, for her safety, he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something had been lost along the way. He had avenged his daughter, but at what cost? As he looked down at Ava, still asleep, her chest rising and falling slowly, Caleb knew there would never be closure. He had done what needed to be done, but the cost of vengeance was something no one could escape. It was the price he had paid for keeping his promises, for protecting his family, and in the quiet of that room, in the stillness of his heart, Caleb finally understood. There was no going back. The world Caleb had fought to protect his family, his daughter, was slowly coming back into focus. Ava was alive. She would recover, piece by piece, and he would be there for her, every step of the way. The system had been exposed. The officers who had harmed her were no longer in power. But Caleb knew the aftermath wasn't just about justice, it was about the human cost of revenge. That's as the days passed, Caleb didn't sleep much. He stayed by Ava's side, watching as she recovered, though it was a slow and painful process. But despite the battle scars, the bruises that would fade with time, Caleb was thankful that his daughter was alive. But there was still a part of him that couldn't shake the sense of loss. The monster he had awakened in himself had been necessary, but it hadn't been easy. The father who had once protected his daughter through love, through peace, was now a stranger to her, just as he was a stranger to himself. He had done what he had to do. He had saved Ava, but at the cost of who he had been.